Well, just want to say again, good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining this first ever Friday Night Forum with Bel Air Church. And we're going to be engaging in this Christian conversation about challenging issues. That's what kind of the Friday Night Forum is designed for. And many of you know, but some of you don't. My name is Mike Morgan. And tonight we're going to be having a conversation about how to have a conversation. Seriously, that's what we're doing tonight. It's before we can jump into any kind of really challenging topic or conversation, I think first it's really important for us to lay down some critical groundwork, some soil, if you will, that we can actually then grow from as we learn how to have healthy Christian conversations with one another regarding challenging issues that we may or may not agree on. So some housekeeping before we get started. I want to let you know that we are recording this. And so if you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't know I was going to be recorded. A couple things you can do. You can change your name on your screen, or you can go dark on your screen. But we really want to capture this because there's some that weren't able to join us tonight that would really want to listen in. So that's going to be available to you on our website. If you enjoy what you hear tonight, you can share it with other people. Even if you don't enjoy what you hear tonight, you can still share it with other people and maybe they'll enjoy it. But anyway, there's going to be this video and audio later on. And then we have an opportunity for you to engage us with questions. So again, we're going to mute everybody, but you have the opportunity to share your questions as you hear Jared's presentation tonight. We have a chat box and you have a little section that says Got Questions. So you can send your questions to Got Questions. We're going to be fielding those. We can't promise that we're going to be able to answer all of them. But we will do our best to address the questions that you have tonight. So tonight is not going to be the end all be all regarding how to have a Christian conversation or how to engage as Christians in this season. It's not a night where all of our questions are going to be answered or that everything's going to be, made all right in the end. It's simply meant to be a starting point. It's just us tiptoeing. It's just the tip of the iceberg of all that we could discuss. And as Jared says in his book, for years, Christians have argued and debated and fought one another while speaking the truth in love. Yet we're no closer to the grace-filled life Jesus modeled. So we've been invited, actually we've invited Jared, who's a biblical scholar. He's a popular podcast host of The Bible for Normal People, which I really like that title. So Jared has been invited to help us cast this new vision for the Christian life that's built not on fighting to be right, but on the risk of love. And so I just mentioned Jared has a book. Here's a shameless plug for it. It's Love Matters More, how fighting to be right keeps us from loving like Jesus. I have plowed through this book. I'm going to go through it again at a much slower pace because there's so much in here that I really want to soak in. But thank you, Jared, for writing this. In fact, you can buy it on Amazon right now. Like literally you could open up a window right now if you wanted to go over there. No judgment. We're not going to know that you're doing it. We won't be offended that you're doing it, but you could just make sure that you come back to this Zoom. Okay, so that's enough housekeeping. Jared, thank you for joining us tonight. It is past 10 where you are, and I'm so grateful that you said yes to this. So thanks for being with us tonight.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. So hopefully all my kids are in bed, but if a sleepy youngster walks into the frame, just don't be surprised at some point. But it's nice to join everyone, and I'm super excited about the idea that you guys have for this Friday Night Forums. Just because I think we can practice, we have a need for practicing difficult conversations. We have a tendency maybe to prioritize uniformity, the assumption that we all believe the same things and do the same things over unity, which is how we can be in relationship to each other in the midst of our differences. So I'm just going to take a little bit of time to walk through a little bit of my thought process in this, and then we'll have some time for some questions. But can everybody hear me okay? We're good on sound? Good.
Hey, Jared, do you mind if I,
yeah.
1 second, do you mind if I open us in prayer and then
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Cool, let's pray together. Lord God, we thank you for tonight. Thanks for creating this space where we can gather together, and knowing that Jared is in a different time zone and there's others that are joining from all over the place. But you've brought us together for this night, and we ask that you would meet with us individually, that you would meet with us collectively as your body. And thank you so much for this opportunity. Lord, bless Jared as he shares with us, and open up our hearts and our ears, that we would be willing to be shaped and molded by you. And ultimately, Jesus, that you would receive glory from all this. We love you. It's your name we pray. Amen.
Amen. So I want to start with this phrase, which has been kind of haunting me for the past few years, which is speaking the truth in love. And in my story, I grew up in a small town in Texas. And for us, speaking the truth in love meant we told the truth and we tried to do it nice. Like that's kind of how it was. And in fact, got to the point where telling the truth to people was the loving thing to do. It didn't really matter how we did it, but there's just the sheer fact that I was telling you my opinion and I was pretty sure I was right. That was the loving thing to do. And it led to a lot of fights, and it led to a lot of hurt. For me, as a pastor, I didn't always walk that well. So this idea of love matters more is sort of my journey through that. So I want to set up kind of this biblical understanding of why love has to be at the center and kind of foundation of our conversations. And I go back to Matthew chapter 22 quite a bit, because I think a lot of our disagreements hinge around kind of what does the Bible mean? And then we try to apply that to these various things like politics or social justice issues or public health or whatever, all the crazy things that we're facing, especially this year. And we're trying to, read it through this lens of the Bible and what it is and what does it mean. And for me, I couldn't think of a better place to start than in Matthew chapter 22, which the context for that is, which is a verse you may have heard quite a bit, or a set of verses. So there's these religious leaders, the pastors of Jesus's day, and they're there to trap Jesus, essentially. And so they ask him this question. One of the Pharisees comes up, who's a scholar in the law, basically a Bible scholar, and says, "Hey, Jesus, which of the commandments is the greatest commandment?" Now, there's 613 commandments in the Old Testament, and that's Jesus's Bible, of course, is the Old Testament. And so it's kind of like, and they're all from God. So it's sort of like asking Jesus, or asking one of us who have kids, which one of your kids is your favorite? It's sort of a trick question, especially if your kids are there and you're supposed to answer this. So it's sort of putting Jesus in a corner. And interestingly enough, Jesus is asked 183 questions in the New Testament, and he only answers 3 directly. And this is one of them. He doesn't even hesitate. What's the greatest commandment? The greatest commandment is that you love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second one is like it, that you love your neighbor as yourself. And those are 2 verses that we actually find in the Old Testament. But then Jesus adds something else and says, all the law and the prophets, which that's a shorthand way of saying the entire Jewish Bible, hang on these 2 commands. They hang on them. So all of our interpretation of the Bible is through this lens of love. So loving God, loving our neighbor is the lens through which we interpret the Bible. Probably one of the most influential authors in the first 1,000 years of church history, St. Augustine, used to write all kinds of big books on Christianity and the Bible. And he has this, in one of his big books, he says, listen, if ever you're confused on which interpretation is best, I can tell you this: whatever interpretation, if it doesn't lead you to this twofold love of God and of neighbor, you can rest assured that you don't understand the scriptures as you ought. So that is the interpretive lens through which we read the Bible. And we see this, Paul reaffirms this in Romans chapter 13, where he says, let no debt remain outstanding except the debt to love one another. All of the commandments are summed up in this one, to love your neighbor as yourself. In fact, James in chapter 2 calls this the royal command, or the royal law found in Scripture. Love your neighbor as yourself. And if you do that, you're doing right. So I think that's really what grounds us in this understanding of love and the primacy of love. And one other verse I want to just mention briefly is in 2 Peter And this was important to me because 2 Peter has this list of things that we're supposed to add on one after the other. He says, for this very reason, add to your faith goodness, and to goodness knowledge, and to knowledge self-control, and to self-control perseverance, and to perseverance godliness, and to godliness mutual affection, and to mutual affection love. And that was really important for me because if I was honest, growing up, my list would have read very differently. My list would have said something like, make every effort to add to your faith goodness, and to goodness knowledge, and to knowledge more knowledge, and to that knowledge being right all the time, and to that feeling superior, and to that being able to argue really well and show that you're right. And that's sort of what this Christian life is all about, is making sure that I'm right about God and I believe all the right things. But that's not what Peter's list says. Actually, on top of knowledge, that's earlier in the list. And the climax of that list is that we add to all that love. And that's the most important thing. So just want to set that stage, because then when we get to this verse in Ephesians chapter 4 of speaking the truth in love, we often just rip that right out of context. And what that means is it's my get out of jail free card for just sharing my opinion whenever and however I want. But if we look real quick at the beginning of chapter 4 of Ephesians, which is an important part of the context because it's the beginning of the chapter, it's setting up Paul's argument. He actually, in the first 3 verses, uses that phrase in love one more time. This time it's not speaking the truth in love, but it's bearing with one another's burdens in love. And I think that's really important for when we're sharing our opinion. If we want it to be heard as loving, we have to ask the question, have we been bearing each other's burdens as well? So that's the context by which we speak this truth, is in the context of a love that bears one another's burdens. And he goes on to give other traits with humility and in patience. And we'll talk about some of these other things in a minute. So if we do in fact have the truth, if Christianity is true in some sense, then we have a lot of power and we have a lot of responsibility, right? With knowledge comes and power comes great responsibility. We learned that from Uncle Ben. And that truth, that power, I like to think of it like a scalpel, right? So it can be a weapon, or it can be an instrument of healing. So our knowledge isn't good or bad, it's neutral, and it can be used for good or it can be used for ill. You know, the scalpel doesn't change. It depends on whose hands it's in, as to whether it's a knife or it's this surgical instrument that heals. And that's what I want to talk about, or maybe these two maybe key factors in determining whether the truth that we have or the opinions that we hold, whether they're going to be a scalpel for healing or whether they're going to be a scalpel for hurting and harming. And how do we determine that? And I think of these two factors, intention and ability. What's our intention? Where's our heart? And then what skills do we have to properly express what's on our heart? And if we don't have one of those, then that scalpel, more often than not, can cut and hurt rather than heal. So we want to be thinking about these two things. How do we make our intentions proper? And then how do we have the right abilities? Because as we know, kind of the road to hell is paved with good intentions. It's not just intentions, but also the impact of what we're saying and the impact of our relationships. If we just stick with the intentions, we often blindly can hurt people. So that's what we're going to talk about for just a few minutes here. These intentions, how do we work on developing to be the kind of people who create safe places for these conversations in the midst of disagreement? And then what are the practical skills that we can maybe develop in having these conversations where we're going to be sharing our opinion? Now, I'm going to digress just for a second because I'm using this word opinion and truth and I'm interchanging them. And I just wanted to start with the idea for me, and we don't have enough time to really flesh this out, but for me, it starts with the humility to recognize that my opinion and the truth of things aren't always the same thing. I know it's hard to admit that and acknowledge that, But everything else I'm going to share tonight is grounded in these 4 words: I could be wrong. I think those are incredibly powerful and important words for us to really take hold of. And I take this from, Paul in 1 Corinthians 13, I think it is, says, right now we see things in a murky way. We see things through a glass dimly and darkly. So right now we don't see as we ought. The interesting thing about that verse is at the end he says, but what's more important is that we are known. So it's that God knows us. It's not about what we know. It's about who knows us. And that's what grounds us. So that humility, we can be confident in not what we know. I don't need to know everything. I don't need to be right about all this. I need to be grounded in who knows me, that God knows me. And that gives me the freedom and the courage to say, I could be wrong. So everything else sort of is grounded in that. If we can't get there, we're going to have a hard time having these conversations. But if we can start there, that will be a good place to begin. So kind of when we understand that love is primary and it is grounding everything that we do, and then we have this power, and how do we help our intentions to be good? What can we be building? And I want to go back to Ephesians chapter 4 for these, because he has a list of things in there that we can do to be building this unity, building this love. And I'm going to phrase it a little differently. So he talks about bearing with one another. And so I'm going to have this as what we can, one thing we can work on in these conversations is investment before opinions. Are we investing in people before we give our opinions? It's so easy, especially on social media, to just throw opinions out to people that I haven't invested in. And then I'm expecting them to just know that I love them and trust me when I say it's for their good, rather than building into them that investment. So I talk a lot about social capital. So if I haven't built into you and made deposits, whenever I tell you the truth in a way that is potentially hurtful, no one likes to hear that maybe your opinion is wrong or you're doing something that may be potentially harmful. People don't like to hear that. But if I haven't given those deposits, when I make that withdrawal, my relationship with you is bankrupt. And I can't expect that you're going to hear it in love. So investment before opinions. That's what I take to mean when Paul says that we have to bear with one another in love. Bearing with one another is investing in the relationship before we give those opinions. So investment over opinions. 2, again, humility over arrogance. We have to have humility over arrogance. And again, in Ephesians 4, that's one of the things he lists, humility. And I think too, in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, Paul is talking about some of these rules. Well, we all know that food sacrificed to idols is no big deal. And he says, but guess what? Knowledge puffs up. So it's not the knowledge. That's not the important thing. We have to have that humility. So humility over arrogance, investment over opinions, humility over arrogance. And these are, again, things that we have to constantly be working on. These are character traits. Before we ever get into a difficult conversation, we're bringing something to the table. And I'm hoping that I can be working on building, bringing that investment, bringing humility, and bringing these other things already to the table in these conversations. It's just an ongoing work. So thirdly, compassion over rightness, which Paul in this list I'm going to call is what he calls gentleness. Compassion over rightness. Can I actually, at the end of the day, will this be a sufficient conversation? Will I consider this a successful conversation if I come out of it feeling like I was compassionate? Or is it only a good conversation if I come out of it feeling like I was right? So am I here to win or to be compassionate? So compassion over rightness, which again, I would say Paul sums up in this word gentleness. Are we being gentle in our conversations? I think a lot of us have had those conversations where we win the battle, but we lose the war. So we win the battle, and in the moment we're stoked. And then we spend the night tossing and turning in our beds thinking, oh man, I was a real jerk. So we won the battle, we lost the war. Compassion over rightness. This ties to the next one I wanted to share, which is connection over convincing. This is really important because in a lot of these conversations, this is the word that Paul uses here that I'm covering under this is patience. Can we be patient? Because what we want in a conversation around something we disagree with is we want to have closure. So at the end of that conversation, I want you to agree with me, and you want me to agree with you. And it just doesn't feel right until we get to that point. So we just kind of keep going after it. But what if the goal isn't convincing one another, but if we understand each other, if it's a connection? So can I start to develop this mindset where a conversation is about connection and not about convincing you? That's, I think, an important one. It's that patience that Paul talks about. And then the next one is curiosity over judgment. I like to say that curiosity and judgment make poor roommates. So it's very hard to be judgmental when I'm being curious. When I'm just there in a posture of wanting to understand and learn, it's really hard for me to judge, because judgment says, I know and I deem you incorrect. Curiosity says, I don't know. Maybe there's something behind this that I'm not sure about yet. Maybe you're in a different place than I'm assuming you're at, right? So curiosity over judgment. And then the last two, I want to just say, are kind of the opposite in this. And this is important because I tend to be, I got in trouble for this one time. I think I had a podcast episode once called How to Talk to People You Disagree With. And the whole episode was from the standpoint of the person who likes to argue and who is the aggressor in a conversation, because that's me, and that has been me my whole life. So someone reached out and was like, hey, like, not everyone's like that. Some people don't speak up for themselves. Some people just take it, and they don't know how to actually voice their own opinion and have a voice. So these last two, I think, are really helpful. And it's over what Paul talks about as peace. How do we have peace? And I think sometimes some of us, we mistake uniformity or being nice with peace. So in my tradition, I'm actually Mennonite. We talk about the difference between peacekeeping and peacemaking. Peacekeeping is, I don't want to ruffle feathers, so I'm just not going to say anything. Right? But peacemaking is, I'm going to stand up for what I believe, but I'm going to do it with compassion, and I'm going to stay in relationship with you, even in the conversation. So the way I phrase this is, can we have respectful disagreement over silent resentment? Because sometimes what we do is we just stay silent in the face of someone, a family member or a friend who's saying something we disagree with. We stay silent. So instead of engaging in that relationship, over time, what we do is we just distance from each other, because we don't want to be around someone that we feel like we can't be ourselves and speak openly and honestly about who we are and what our convictions are. And so some of us, we just shut down and we go into kind of silent resentment. So we want to have respectful disagreement. Disagreement's fine. It's actually good. It means that we have diversity. And then the last one, which I think is really important in terms of kind of character traits, these bigger developmental things that we can be working on a regular basis, is, I just said, I don't have a better way of saying this, but it's developing boundaries over being a doormat. Because we do have some of these conversations where it's no longer a beneficial it's not even a relationship. It's a one-sided verbal beating where someone's just there to pound their opinion into us, and they have no intention of hearing us, listening to us, respecting us, loving us, showing us compassion, having any humility. And there's only so much that we're responsible for. We have to remember the end of that phrase in Matthew 22, love your neighbor as yourself, which implies that I love myself too. So I love this quote from Prentice Hemphill that says, boundaries are the distance at which I can love you and me simultaneously. So a boundary is always keeping in mind that distance at which I can love you and me simultaneously. And sometimes for me to stay in a loving posture, I actually have to have a boundary. Like, I can't keep having these conversations where I'm not going to go into a good place. And so I may have to shut down conversation for a time. So I think it's important that we learn how to have boundaries. That's hard for a lot of us because I was taught that having boundaries was being unkind, and that's not nice. Okay, so those are some key principles here, 6 or 7 things that we can be thinking about as principles and character traits to develop over time. Those aren't something that, if you don't have humility or compassion or desire for connection, when you go into a difficult conversation, you're probably not going to be able to conjure that up in the moment. Right? Those are spiritual disciplines that take time and energy and intention to develop. Right? And so, but there are some practical things that we can talk about when you're in a conversation about, again, whether it's about social justice issues or politics, religious differences. What does the Bible mean about this thing or that thing? These are just some tips and tricks that I've learned over the years of being a pastor, as well as I spent a number of years being a family business advisor. So I worked almost every day in very contentious situations. And these would be some of the tools that we would use to help get through some really challenging relationships. So the first is use questions. Questions are so powerful. Questions don't often put us in the defense. Now, we have to ask good questions, and I think that's a practical skill to develop. Sometimes we use questions as a weapon. We call those leading questions or passive-aggressive questions or rhetorical questions. We don't want to ask those, but we want to ask genuinely curious questions. I want to understand you. So when someone says something in the context that I don't agree with, well, I think, I'm pretty sure that the Bible means this. Oh, well, tell me a little bit. I disagree with that. I already know I disagree with that, but that's not what I lead with, because I really want to understand the whole picture. Oh, really? Tell me a little bit more. Like, why did you come to that conclusion? Oh, okay. Have you ever heard of any other conclusions that you might come to? Tell me a little bit more about like your tradition and your family. Like, is that how your parents would have thought about the Bible or thought about that issue? There's so many questions we can ask that's genuinely curious, that leads to that connection. And me, at the end of the day, even if we disagree, I got to learn more about you. I got to learn who you are, where you come from, what motivates you, why are you the way you are? And that's valuable regardless of where we end the conversation. Again, that's that connection over convincing. So use questions, both to understand and to persuade. I found that just by asking questions, sometimes to my family members, I'm able to get them to a place where they see things differently. And it really wasn't I wasn't arguing. I was just asking genuine questions that led them to a different place. So getting good at asking the right questions is just as important as getting good at being able to, when someone says, well, why do you believe that you pull out your note card and you have like the 6 points about why you believe that. Right? That's usually less convincing and less helpful overall. So use questions. Number 2, and this is really important, is get into the habit of using what we call I statements. So I statements are being able to own your own opinions and your own feelings and not making blanket universal statements, so that we can have a personal relationship. So, hey, this is how I feel about that. There's almost an implied recognition that we're creating space for other people to have other opinions. But if I say, well, this is the way it is, what I've done is sort of shut down conversation and I've put people on the defense. So now you can either agree with me or you can be wrong. It's really your 2 choices, right? You don't have to agree with me, but that just means you're wrong. So using I statements, this is how I feel about it. And then an invitation, how do you feel about it? So that can be hard. That whenever we start getting stressed or angry in a conversation, we can actually switch to you language, which is blame language. Well, you always do this, or your people, or your side, the right, the left, we label a whole group of people, right? Now we're talking in these big generalities. But when we talk about I statements, I'm just talking about me and I'm talking about you. And I'm talking about our relationship right now, right? We're not world leaders sitting in the Oval Office or around a big conference table solving all the world's problems. I'm trying to build a relationship with this human being that's sitting right in front of me that has a different opinion. And I statements bring us back to that connection point. A third thing that I often do is in the conversation, even for my own sake and for the other person, I'll often state reminders that I'm for you. Like, I'm on your team. We're not trying to now take sides. I'm trying to understand where you're coming from. So I'm for you. I love you. I care about you. Whatever your opinion isn't going to change how I treat you, how I relate to you. Just a reminder that I'm here for you. The next one, which gets a little bit technical for just a second, but it's so important, and because I see it so much, is avoiding straw men, right? You may have heard that term before. A straw man is when I take the worst example of what you're talking about, and then I assume that's what you're talking about, and then I go after that thing, right? So we do this, right? So we like to generalize and characterize something. So if I said, yeah, in 2012, I voted for Obama. Okay, I may take that and I may make all these assumptions about what that means about you. And I'm what's called creating a straw man. And then I'm going to say, well, I can't believe that you X, Y, and Z, and make some conclusion off of that thing. Right? So a straw man is whenever I take what you said and I go 2 or 3 steps further and I just make all these assumptions and conclusions for you, and then I'm arguing against that. So I'll talk about in a minute, one way to avoid that, well, I'll just say it now because it's tied in, is something I call active listening. So using the phrase, so what I hear you saying is this, am I understanding you correctly? And if they say, no, that's not what I'm saying at all, then I believe them and I let them reframe what they're saying. And I say, oh, okay. I understand now. This is what I'm hearing you say. Until we get to the point where they say, yes, you're hearing me right. That's what I mean by that. And we do this quite a bit, especially around things like pro-life, pro-choice, when he talks about political differences. Those 2 phrases, pro-life, pro-choice, are sort of straw men in themselves, right? So what I'm saying when I say I'm pro-life is I'm saying if you don't agree with me, you're pro-death. And if I'm saying I'm pro-choice, I'm telling you you're anti-choice, right? And that's already creating this straw man. So I need to get past that and avoid that. And I can do that by active listening, making sure I would never want to argue against someone's position without them first saying, yes, that's what I actually believe. That's what active listening does. So I heard you saying that the reason that you voted for this candidate was because of X, Y, and Z. Yeah, that's what yep. Okay. Now I know what we're talking about. Usually we will run to one extreme or the other. The other thing that here is, I like to call it ignorance or evil logic. Ignorance or evil. So there's this assumption that there's only one right answer in all of these complex things that we're talking about. And if you don't agree with me, you're either ignorant or you're evil, right? So we do this when we use words like, it's not rocket science. So I've been in meetings before where we actually had to, we're not allowed to use that phrase. It's not rocket science. Because if it's so simple, another phrase I hear a lot on Facebook is, I don't know how anyone could believe that. So I would encourage that phrase to be taken out of your vocabulary. Both of those phrases. It's not rocket science. And I don't know how anyone could ever believe that X, Y, and Z. That's what I call ignorance or evil logic. Because what you're saying is, this is such a cut and dry, simple issue that if you don't agree with me, there's really only 2 options. Either you're so ignorant that you can't see how simple it is, or you're so blinded by your evil motives that you are just ignoring how simple it is. Right? So you're either ignorant or you're evil because it's so cut and dry and it's such a simple thing. Right? And now I've definitely created a straw man. So the person I'm talking to now, the only 3 options you have is agree with me, be ignorant, or be evil. But I would argue there's often a 4th option, which is these are really complicated and complex issues, and we might just be understanding it in a different, nuanced way. So I'll try to avoid those 2 phrases. It's not rocket science, and I can't believe anyone would ever believe X, Y, and Z. Then again, the last thing that I'm going to share, and then we're going to have some time for some questions, is this idea of boundaries. That's a practical tip as well as a principle, because I think it's so important. To be loving doesn't mean you have to keep hearing the same opinions from the same people over and over and over. Right? The flip side of that is it's okay that someone can hear your opinion one time, and it's not your obligation or responsibility to bring that up every time you talk to that person. Once they know where you stand, that's where it can be. So we want to respect people enough to say, if they want to talk about it again, bring it up, or ask them, would you mind if we talk about this again? Rather than giving unsolicited opinions. So that's the flip side of boundaries. And the boundary can be, you don't always have to accept people's unsolicited opinions to be loving or to be kind. That's not our responsibility as humans to always do that. And each of us have a different line for that. Some people are very sensitive, and it will just ruin their day to have a 5-minute contentious conversation about politics at the breakfast table with their in-laws. And it's not worth the rest of their day. For other people, they're energized by that, and they could have that conversation for an hour every morning and they would be fine. So we have to recognize the last practical tip for me is, and this is a little controversial, I'll say it this way. I'm not negating the golden rule, but the golden rule is limited, right? The golden rule is limited because the golden rule says, treat others the way you want to be treated. That's limited because the example I just gave you, well, what if other people aren't like me? So my spouse and I are a good example of this. I love arguing. So if I treat someone the way I want to be treated, I'm going to argue all the time, right? That's the golden rule. I'm just treating you the way I want to be treated. I want to argue about this. I like arguing. It gives me energy. I don't take it personally. It's totally fine. Meanwhile, my spouse is shutting down because that's not how she finds intimacy, and that's not how she finds connection, right? So I'd rather us practice the platinum rule, which is treat other people the way that you've learned from them that they want to be treated. And that implies connection, communication, and relationship. And whenever I learn how they want to be treated, I respect that and I treat them that way. And I think that's really important in this context of speaking the truth in love. So that was a mouthful. I ran through a lot of things, but that's why we have some time now to unpack some of it.
Wow, that was awesome. Thank you so much, Jared. There is a lot there, and already I'm seeing some really great questions on the chat. So again, if you have any questions that you want to share with us, you can do it. You can share us your name, where you're from, or you can keep them confidential. Either way, that's fine. And again, we're not going to be able to get to every question, but I got Matt Warner, who's in this Zoom with us. He's a pastor, good friend of mine, and he has a really good question. It says, it seems that a lot of Christians see their political view as the gospel view. How can Christians begin to see that their political view is not necessarily the gospel view?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think understanding what the gospel is really important. And I would say it this way. In my experience, I've been a part of traditions where they just continually shrink smaller and smaller and smaller, and they keep kicking more and more people out because they start putting more and more doctrine and beliefs and things into what it means to be a Christ follower. And pretty soon that's a slippery slope, because then the only person left in that circle is you. Right? If to be a Christian, everyone has to believe exactly like me, that circle gets real small real quick. And so recognizing that diversity of kind of where we are with the body of Christ, I think it's really important. So for me, I keep coming back to, a lot of times we want to talk about what we're against, but I found that actually to help that, I talk more about what I'm for. And I find there's a lot of agreement on what I'm for. Like, I'm for people. I'm for loving people. And so when I say love matters more in terms of the title of the book, now let's have a conversation about what that means. What we don't disagree on is that love matters more. We all agree that love matters more. What we really disagree on is what's the most loving thing to do in this situation, right? And so for me, the gospel is that love matters more, and that Christ showed that love, and that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. And, that's kind of what we can agree on. How that gets expressed in our world, man, that is a complicated matter. So.
That's good. That's good. Another question. Someone asked, what if there's a subject that will change your opinion or relationship with the other person? What do you do with that?
Maybe Mike, you can extrapolate on that. I'm having a hard time understanding what an example of that might be.
If there's a conversation that you want to have, or a perspective that you feel conviction about, and someone is having this conversation with you, it's on a various topic, and you're like, do I want to enter into that conversation with the person? Because one, the fact that they brought it up, now my opinion of them might be shifting, or I'm afraid to share because now their opinion might shift towards me. How do we have this conversation with someone that might disagree with me, but the very topic of conversation might actually shift our relationship?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're touching on is the real risk of relationship. I think it's very natural and appropriate to be afraid in that situation, because it's risky. We all feel this. For me, what the question behind the question I hear in that is, what happens if I'm not sure it's safe to truly be myself in a relationship, to truly bring how I feel about a particular topic to this relationship? And I think that's a really good question. And we're going to flub it. We're going to make mistakes, and we're going to try and be vulnerable, and someone is going to probably hurt us, or they may surprise us and accept us for who we are. And we may surprise ourselves and accept someone else for who they are, even though we thought we disagreed, really emotionally on an emotional level about this thing. But that's the risk of relationship. But I think the alternative is what you said, which is fear. And for me, perfect love casts out fear. Not only do we love, but are we willing to receive love? And that's sometimes in our culture, I think it's riskier to try to be vulnerable and try to receive that love than it is to be the one who's always doing the loving. So I think you're just touching on the risk of relationship, and that's scary, and that's part of the gig.
Yeah, well, and it goes back to what you're talking about, peacemaking versus peacekeeping, right? So we could peacekeep, and what we're doing by not engaging in that conversation is we're actually separating ourselves from relationships. So at the end, you're going to end the relationship either way, so, or you could risk and actually win a relationship, even though even at the end of the day, you might disagree, you still could win the relationship. But you're choosing the risk and lean into that.
And I think it does. One other thing I wanted to say, because, there's this place in John where he talks about, Jesus talks about worshiping it authentically. And I think that's important, because what happens when we don't take that risk, and I think maybe maybe it's just me and my tradition, but I've been in churches where we just start pretending, because that's the risk, right? It's easier for me to just pretend I'm a certain way and to keep that peace. And so then I start taking my authentic self and I start putting it on the back burner. I start putting it in the closet more and more. And then the shame voice comes in, which is, now if I'm found out, I'll really be exposed as a fraud. I can't be found out for what I really believe now. And that's just so toxic, I think, in a church culture where we just slowly start to back away from our true selves because we're afraid that our true self isn't going to be accepted. So we have to have some courageous people who are going to be fully themselves in that risk of relationship, for the sake of being authentic, right?
Yeah. I have a sense in me that as we're talking, I can see examples in my own life where I've held things down for so long that finally when I want to share it, it's like, whoa, Mike, why is it up to 11 right now? Well, the person doesn't know that I've been holding it for 15 years and it's just going to unleash on you right now. Whoa, I didn't know I was going to get this from the fire hose,
Yeah.
And I think it's whoa, okay, easy there, maybe share it in some other circles before you just kind of dump everything onto one human being.
Yeah.
Oh man. Well, I Yeah, I haven't read, there's some good questions coming in. Let me just read it. I haven't read this one yet, but my brother and sister are polar opposites on just about every topic. It's sad to watch them argue at family gatherings. What do you recommend as a third party watching an unloving disagreement with people you love?
Yeah, that's really hard. I think I have two things. One, it's another lesson that we teach a lot, which is be careful not to what we call triangulate. It's really easy to think that the loving thing to do is to mediate that. And usually by mediate, we mean let this person complain about the other person behind their back to me, and then let the other person complain about that person behind their back to me. And I get to be the holder of everybody's anxiety and issues. But what that does is actually enables the other people not to go to one another. And so that can actually build a lot of distance over time because they just go to me. And then once they unload on me, they feel better. So they can be around each other for a little while longer until it builds back up. And then they unload on me. And then they do that. And that becomes a pattern in a family. And the person who's the enabler is often like, what, me? I didn't do anything wrong. Like, I'm just the loving listener. It's like, well, you've created this dynamic where they don't have to go to one another. So I think avoiding that triangulation and encouraging them to go to one another can be really good. But I think the flip side of that is, I know this is hard. I know it's really hard. It's hard for me. But sometimes the best thing to do is just be sad and not try to take responsibility for other adults' relationships. It's really hard, especially if you love them both and you're in the same family. But I think sometimes we actually kind of can make it worse because we get emotionally involved and we think it's our job to fix that relationship, right? So I think there's ways that my encouragement is actually to keep building strong relationships with them individually and continue to encourage that they allow love to matter more and connect with one another directly and sort of resist that, hey, I want to build a relationship with you, but I don't want my relationship with you to be built on a mutual talking about this other person behind their back. That doesn't seem like a good, healthy relationship. I just want to know you. And then through my modeling, maybe good communication, directness, authenticity, they can learn now how to go to one another.
That's good. Someone on the forum asked, kind of in this, there's some people might be feeling like, well, it sounds like we're more concerned about feelings than for making sure the truth is defended. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I think that's one, I would like to say yes, because I think the pendulum has been swung too far. And I think it's time we do talk about our feelings because they matter and they're important. They're part of our bodies. They are often messengers that are telling us important things, right? So I do think that, again, when I have a book called Love Matters More, and there's a reason it's not called Only Love Matters. I feel like people are sensitive to this idea of standing up for the truth so that they actually read Love Matters More as only love matters. But that's actually not the point. Just like the reason I read 2 Peter at the beginning was knowledge is a part of that. It's in the list. It's important. But in that list and in others in the New Testament, that's not the end goal. The actual end goal is love. And so knowledge and truth are a tool for love, not the other way around. The end goal is love. And just to make this, not to kind of secularize this, but in the history in the 20th century, this was a big moment in the 40s and 50s because we had this era of progress for a few hundred years. We had all these scientific innovations, and we thought if we just know the truth about things, we will get to this peaceful world. And then the 40s came and we developed atomic bombs with our knowledge, and we had worldwide devastation and war and sacrifice and killing each other. And there was this sort of, at least in people who think about these things a lot, there was sort of this despair for a while of like, oh, the knowledge, the truth didn't bring the peaceable world we thought it would because it became divorced from love. It became divorced from and became prioritized over love. And so for me, the whole point is not, oh, let's just get rid of truth. It's let's properly situate truth as a stepping stone to love. And in that conversation, we have to allow for emotions and feelings. And I mean, if we want to do away with those things, yeah, we can have a whole world of facts, but it's going to be devoid of humans.
Yeah, that's good. Devoid of humans, devoid of relationship. Yep.
Mhm.
Some people are asking similar questions in some ways. One was, if someone in having a conversation requires me to agree with an idea in order to continue in the conversation, what's the best way forward if I don't agree? Similar question, how do I communicate with someone so staunch in their belief that they won't even agree to disagree? And so, like, how do you move past some of these hurdles of, I want to continue conversation, but you're now, saying this is how we have to move forward. That seems like a challenging situation.
Yeah. I mean, a few things that come to mind. One is sometimes we have to have what I would call like a meta conversation, which is outside of, so let's say we're talking about, I had a conversation, a pretty heated conversation with my mom recently about Black Lives Matter, just that idea. And so we have to, have these meta conversations where we can go back and not talk about Black Lives Matter. We're not talking about that. We're talking about our relationship. And I can ask the question, is it okay if we disagree on things like that? Like, how do we handle disagreements in our relationship? Let's take it out of like this specific context and just talk about, how are we going to do this? Like, what's an appropriate way? And that those conversations can be really generative in a way that it can't be if we're talking about a particular issue, especially if we're in that moment when feelings are high, when we're both getting defensive and we're digging in our heels. That's not an appropriate time. But maybe a few days later, we have a conversation about the conversation and just say, how do we do this better in the future? Like, I care about you. I want to have a relationship with you. And this is a roadblock. How do we move past that in our conversations? So I think if we can have those kind of conversations outside of the emotionally tense moment, that can be really helpful. And the second thing I would say is, I think sometimes we get zeroed in on that part of our identity. And it just, even as Christians, I think our identity is in something else besides our opinion about point X. And so how do we build relationship with it? Just speaking in terms of my conversation with my mom, is I made it a point to, again, that social capital, to just make deposits, like show her over the next few months. I care about her as a human being. Like, it's not about this conversation. I don't have to just keep coming back to this conversation over and over. It's like, that's a bankrupt account. Like, I got to go make some more deposits and talk about the rest of our humanity so we can both be reminded that we're more than our opinion about this one thing. We're also husbands and moms and daughters and sons and little league cheerleaders. And like, we're all these other things that can connect us. And being human, again, I think we've overprivileged our mind to think that what it means to be human is to be this collection of checkmark beliefs. And so whenever we overprivilege that becomes so central. And I can't even imagine talking to someone who believes differently than me, when 80 to 90% of our life is in the everyday of rubbing shoulders and learning how to love in the more mundane things.
There is a lot here, and there's a lot to practice. I mean, even the simple thing of, Jared, you just throw it out there like, we got to be good at asking questions. And I'm like, I've heard that from my wife multiple times. Like, you need to be better at asking questions. And I'm like, how do I become better at asking questions? Like, where's the app for that? Like, what can I do to like learn that art form? If I could just be better at that one thing, like, it would transform relationships that I have with others. I mean, there's just such rich content, but it's not meant to just be head knowledge. It's meant to like be walked out in love.
Right.
And we didn't start this by saying it, but we just got to call it out. We are in really challenging times. Like, there's a lot of fear right now. There's a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of anger and things that are being lobbed over, the walls towards the other. Unfortunately, we, might demonize the other, or we might consider the other our enemy. And we're walking into this. It's like we've been swimming in this environment, it feels like, but we're all, I've heard, myself included, there's anxiety coming to what would happen in the next month or so, and I just want to vocalize that so it's in the air, that this is really, really challenging. And there's a lot of questions here. I mean, there's, what does it look like to support those who are oppressed while loving the oppressor? Like that's, what does it mean, Jared, for me to actually listen to someone on a whole host of things that we could, disagree with? I can name them, like COVID-19, our civil liberties, race relations, the role and effectiveness of policing. The list could go on. And yet, if you want to just sit and have a conversation with someone, but having a conversation with that person often suggests that you're endorsing them,
Mm-hmm.
like,
Mm-hmm.
how do you speak? How do you listen and say, look, I'm engaging in relationships? I'm not going to answer. I want to hear what you have to say.
No, I think that's a really, one thing I'm going to challenge. And again, maybe I'm overstepping here, but I think that I'll speak for myself. If I ask the question, am I worried that I'm endorsing someone by having a deep conversation about things we disagree with? Usually what I mean by that is I'm worried about the perception for my tribe and what they're going to think of me. And I would just say, let's dig there into maybe, is that appropriate? I mean, Jesus was the kind of person who was often slandered by the religious tribe for doing things that weren't seen as what good Christians should be doing. He was often talking to the people he disagreed with. And so I think we should have to be careful with our motives there a little bit for why that's such a big problem. What see if I can.
I think you're good.
Good. So I think that's really important, is to ask, why is it such a big deal that people think that I'm endorsing this?
Yeah.
What does that, if I'm comfortable and I know that I can sit down with someone and listen intently and say, I totally understand where you're coming from. I disagree. We come to different conclusions, but I get it. If I'm comfortable with that, thinking that's not an endorsement, why do I get so paranoid or afraid of what other people think as an endorsement? Mm. So I think there's just so much inner work for me. Like, that's why I wanted to start with, it starts with our own heart. And I think there's a lot of digging we can do, because there's one thing where we disagree, and then there's another where anger and fear play. And sometimes I think we think that we can't separate those. But in my life, I have been able to separate those, and I can love you, and I can respect you and your different opinions. And I can do that without anger or without fear, even if it's things that I disagree on a fundamental level, just absolutely fundamental. I can still have compassion towards you. But I think sometimes we think that that's an impossible task to pull those apart.
Jared, I feel like I want to just keep we can go another hour. I mean, I want to, I really appreciated this conversation. Thanks so much for taking your time. I know it's late where you are. Thank you for the energy and effort you've put into this. I really appreciate you helping us lay the foundation. And I know I say that because I was going to joke like, oh, well, we did it, right? I mean, there we go, Jared, we did it. We're good. All of us who have been watching this Zoom, we're all going to just be able to walk out of here and engage. And it's going to take a lot of energy, isn't it? I mean, it's going to take a lot of intentional work on our parts to actually be the church and lean into conversations with those we disagree with in love. And really, do we embrace that love, in fact, does matter more? And how then do we love one another? And you have so many examples of Christ and how he commands his disciples to love. And so we want to be those disciples. We want to be Christians, and they'll know that we are Christians by our love, and so it's really important. But thank you, Jared, for your time tonight. And I want to give a special thanks to Aaron Pineda and Brian Watson and Peyton Hoffman for helping to make tonight possible. I want to thank all of you for, first Friday night. I know it's COVID, and some of you guys could have been going to that outdoor restaurant, and yet you chose to be here tonight. So thank you for leaning in and wanting to develop these healthy skills for how to have real Christian conversations with those that we disagree with. Jared, if I want to dive deeper into this, or I want to just continue to soak in what we're talking about, I know I can buy, your book, which is going to be helpful. It has been helpful, and I need to saturate in that. But what are some other ways we can connect with you?
Yeah, I mean, one thing is if you do buy the book, not to plug it more, but we did leave it up for, if you go to my website, which you can go to lovemattersmorebook.com or jaredbyas.com, there's actually a place in there that if you have a receipt code from when you bought the book, we left up, it was supposed to be for pre-order, but people have said it's really helpful. It's just a 3-part video series it's pretty tied to the things we've been talking about today, but I do talk about some other areas and dig a little bit deeper. So even if you just wanted a refresher on some of the things we've been talking about, you can actually go to the site and plug that in, and you download these 3 videos. They're about 20 minutes each. So it's about an hour's worth, kind of like tonight. But just to rehash it, because I know we covered a lot of things. And I also just wanted to say too, I appreciate that you say this isn't about learning in our heads. I just feel like, especially since March, man, we've been like saturated with just getting information from our screens, but this is about walking. And so, one of the things I keep coming back to, someone mentioned earlier, where do we balance the truth in this loving? And I come back to 3 John, which, that's the old book not a lot of people talk about. But one of my favorite verses as I was writing this book is in verse 3, and he says, I have no greater joy than to hear that my children are walking in the truth. And that for me was a clue to say, wait a minute, I thought we just believed the truth. I thought the truth was this thing in our heads. What does it mean to walk in it? Yeah. How do we walk in the truth? And for me, that's that life of love. That's the challenge now, is not how we believe the truth. That's the easy part. It's how do we walk in the truth? How does that truth get expressed in our love in our life every single day? It's easy to love people in the abstract as a check mark in my head. It's really hard when you're annoying me and you're being aggressive and you're spouting off opinions that I really don't like. That's when the rubber meets the road, and we have to ask, are we walking in the truth? Yeah. So,
and we can be a community that practices that. Let's as a community, with those we have social capital with, let's be, grace-filled people that allow one another to practice and to make mistakes and to mess up, but try again. And we need to continue to practice this. This isn't something that we can develop on and then just all of a sudden come out as pro. We have to actually put it into practice, And so that's my heart for us as a church. That's my heart for us as a community. That's my heart for our city, that we can actually walk in this way and do it. We're not going to do it perfect, but man, let's give it a go. Let's try. You can follow Jared on his podcast, The Bible for Normal People. You can follow Bel Air Church on Instagram or Facebook. And you can join us again on our next Friday night forum. It's going to be on October 30th. And are you ready for this? That's the day before Halloween. I know you guys have massive plans for Halloween. Oh wait, Los Angeles, I think they canceled Halloween, so no candy for us. But oh man, you ready? How to talk to people across the political aisle. I think Jared is laying some foundation, and he just is like, are you sure you want to do that? It could be challenging, but we're going to try to engage that conversation as we're approaching November, because we want to love one another well. And we're going to share some ghost stories. I'm just kidding. We're not going to do that. But it is the night before Halloween. All right. No more jokes. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. We love you all. Go in peace and walk in love. And you guys have a great night. See you next time. Bye.